Thank you so much for having me here. It always feels like I'm home among people that I know, and very much appreciate. I get goosebumps watching that video, honestly, because May Day was really incredible, and it was just like a really big show of solidarity among so many groups of people here in New York City. My talk really is going to be very casual, to be honest. I thought it would be like a round table, so I'm wishing that I'm not standing up, but. So if you haven't heard, today is actually the 25th day of the dignity strike, in which estimated somewhere between 1,500 to 1,800, if not more, Palestinian prisoners are engaged in a hunger strike in which they're only consuming water with salt. And the latest we've heard is that even the salt has been taken out of their water, so that they, cannot sustain themselves and are forced to give up on the hunger strike, because they know the Israeli occupation knows that it would be such a detrimental thing on them if many people passed away in this hunger strike. And they're very resilient. We've seen so many cases of prisoners engage in hunger strikes and lasting a long time, but it is very deteriorating on their health. Today, I learned that it's the 25th day that even more prisoners announced that they were going to be joining the hunger strike, as it is the 25th day. Even Fatah, the Palestinian faction, in which the Palestinian Authority belongs to, if we want to kind of generalize it in that way, announced that prisoners that belong to the Fatah party should also be in solidarity and should also engage in the hunger strike, which is kind of amazing, because the hunger strike is actually, the dignity strike, it's not just targeting or confronting the Israeli occupation. It's actually also confronting the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority that has failed its people. The Palestinian Authority that has turned its back on its people, that is supposed to represent us as Palestinians. Excuse me. The Palestinian Authority has continues to engage in security coordination. One of the offsets or the circumstances that the signing of the Oslo Agreement in 1993 has resulted in. And that's really, I've seen it in person where, from my village, for example, we've had people imprisoned by the Palestinian Authority. I've been on buses traveling through Palestine, and we wouldn't get stopped as normal by the Israeli soldiers. We'd actually get stopped by Palestinian police officers asking us where we're going, because they're in direct contact with the occupation, making, doing all the dirty work on behalf of the Israeli occupation. I remember when it was in the Intifada times, we would always be stopped by Israeli soldiers. Sometimes the checkpoints were very present and prominent, and other times they would literally appear out of nowhere, like jump literally in front of the car, point their guns at the vehicles. And I remember being young and not really understanding, because I didn't live in Palestine, but I would visit. And it was such a jarring thing to witness as a child. That was something that was very normal for Palestinians during the Intifada times. Now what we're seeing is that there are the checkpoints, but there's also Palestinian security that is engaging in those same tactics, that are stopping people, asking them where they're going. So you're not seeing so much. You are still seeing a lot of Israeli soldiers on the ground, for sure, but you're seeing a combination now, and that's terrible. I can go on a lot about this, how it really affects people from a daily basis. And there's actually a funny cartoon that I always think about that has, it's in Arabic, and if I knew that there was a screen, I might have pulled it up. But it's in Arabic, and it's somebody being detained, and he's blindfolded, so he doesn't know who's detaining him. So he's actually asking, pardon me, or if it's not too much trouble, can you tell me, are you occupation or are you authority? Like, are you the occupation or are you the Palestinian Authority? Because that's the reality, unfortunately. The health of the Palestinian prisoners, of course, it would be deteriorating as they are engaged in the 25th day right now. Like I said, all they have is salt and water, and sometimes they can't even have salt because it's been taken away from them. Some of the conditions in which the Palestinian prisoners experience, first of all, many of them are held indefinitely without charge. A lot of times also, if there is a charge, of course, it's sometimes incredibly dubious. And also the conviction rate of Palestinians in Israeli courts is almost 100%. So if you're charged with any crime, you're actually most likely going to be convicted. It's a very racist system, obviously. And that's if you actually have a charge. Like that would settle your conscience. Okay, I'm charged with something. But imagine if you were being detained. And I can tell you, as a Palestinian with most of my family still in Palestine, that the majority, at least of the male population, has been detained once, okay? In my family, most of my cousins, my uncles, even my grandparents, especially I'm talking about the male members of my family, have experienced being detained or imprisoned, sometimes for long periods of time. So this is a reality, and I hope that my experience is enough for you to kind of understand the gravity of the situation, and it still continues to this day. The health is deteriorating, but they're not giving up, obviously. I don't know if you've heard, but another thing to add on to our long boycott list is Pizza Hut. Apparently, Pizza Hut mocked the hunger strike by, there was a rumor going around that Marwan Barghouti, who's a very famous revolutionary and a current political prisoner who is said to have started to organize this strike and who's been imprisoned for a very long time now, serving, I believe, what is a life sentence, is actually not on hunger strike. He's sneaking food, right? That's the rumor, which I personally don't believe. But the rumor is that now, the Pizza Hut recently had an ad or something, or a meme, I don't really know, that it said, like, Marwan, if you're going to be breaking your hunger strike, why don't you order a pizza? Because it looked like he was eating something else, so like, hey, why not Pizza Hut? As if, we're crazy about Pizza Hut, huh? It's something to keep in mind because, unfortunately, this is the Israeli Pizza Hut maybe, but, it's really common for our suffering to be a subject of mockery in Israeli society, unfortunately, whether it's really anything. I think the prisoners really reflect the situation in Palestine. Their situation is that, for example, a lot of the prisons are nowhere within reach for Palestinians. They would have to go through a lot of petitions in order to get permits to enter these quote-unquote Israeli grounds that they can access their families. So a lot of times they have to wait a long time. Sometimes they are just completely cut off. Many of the current strikers are in solitary confinement, being punished for engaging in this hunger strike. And I think some of the, besides the fact that they don't actually have, a lot of them don't have charges, or the charges are dubious, as I mentioned, they want to actually be treated as human beings in the prisons, right? They want to be granted the opportunity for them to have family visits like anyone else. No one wants to be in prison, but at least have the prison conditions be, normal and a little bit tolerance, like a little bit of not so brutal, I would say. Nakba, the Nakba Day commemoration is coming up. It's on May 15th, and the New York for Palestine Coalition decided that May 13th made more sense to commemorate Nakba Day, so we decided that normally we would have a demonstration. Sometimes we would have it around Times Square, but this year we wanted to do it in Bay Ridge, where many of the Palestinians in New York City live, and the rest of the Arab community. The weather isn't very good, unfortunately, for Saturday, and we are still trying to figure out whether or not we're going to hold the demonstration because we don't want to endanger. It's not just like little showers. I heard it's pretty torrential rain, unfortunately, but we'll keep you posted for sure about whether or not that will hold a demonstration, which will be at 1 p.m. At Leif Erikson Park on 67th Street and 4th Avenue. The Nakba commemoration is really important because a lot of times you see people talking about the occupation of Palestine. Palestine is becoming more, what's the word I'm looking for? Easy to accept as a conversation, little by little. And I think that the reason why is because of the persistence of Palestinians when they engage in things like hunger strikes, right? When they engage in resistance, and when they use all venues available for resistance, whether it's armed resistance or not, whether it's through literature, through the arts, whatever it may be. But also the solidarity all over the world has been incredible, and I think that the West can no longer ignore this issue. So they try to make it a little bit more presentable, right? So they say, for example, that the occupation started in 1967, not in 1948. All right. I've seen this many times with even some, very Palestinian, or like all it is about Palestine, and they still say things like the occupation started in 1967. This is something that we must completely reject. The occupation didn't start in 1967, and some people may say not even in 1948. The occupation was brewing way before 1948. It was going to start happening, way before, and the opportunity came in 1948, but this was something in the works for a very long time. So we must reject these words or verbiages where we're talking. It really is important for us to keep in context that this is not going to work in this very liberal way of approaching this issue. I wanted to talk a little bit about imperialism in Palestine, but we talk about it as if, obviously there's all kinds of oppression in Palestine, whether it's colonization, occupation, apartheid, and that's all very present in Palestine. One thing that I wanted to kind of point out is that I think imperialism in Palestine exists in more ways than one. It exists in more than war. It exists in more than, boots on the ground, soldiers, foreign soldiers, invaders coming from everywhere but Palestine to occupy our lands. Another form of imperialism, unfortunately, is nonprofit organizations, okay? The reason being is that the fate of Palestinians has become dependent on foreign aid, nonprofit organizations, and all kinds of intervention in Palestine that's brought to us from outside. Okay, it's never helped us. It's only impeded our ability to resist and impeded our ability to grow out of our chains. So, there's a lot of talk right now about the different kinds of aid and all of this. And I want you to keep in mind that imperialism exists in more ways than one. When we have a lot of foreign aid in the form of, government aid, but also in nonprofit organizations where they come into Palestine and they dictate how we must resist. And sometimes it's not very clear, like it's not always very direct to say, well, I don't want you to do X, Y, Z, this is what I want you to do. They try to make it in a way where it's very, flowery and beautiful and all of this to make sure. And I even heard, for example, this is something that I just learned just a couple of days ago, those things that spin in your hands. You know what I'm talking about? That they were created to distract Palestinian children from throwing rocks. I mean, sometimes it's incredibly subtle. And this is something as atrocious as it sounds, it's not far from the truth. Like, it's not something that's completely foreign and alien. This is how it is. This is how occupation works. This is how imperialism works, right? So we have to be very conscious of the fact that sometimes foreign aid is not a good thing. And I think it's never a good thing, to be honest. The people can prevail without other people's help, because it always comes with stipulations, especially if it's coming from the West. And I want that point to be very clear, because this is a new kind of direction that I think that we are now, as we are continuing to develop our understanding of Palestine, where, like I said, now it's becoming a little easier to talk about Palestine. We've had, in pop culture, we've got some, famous Palestinians, and they're making, when things happen in Palestine, sometimes even non-Palestinian celebrities or whatever, show solidarity with Palestine. So I think that it's now time for us to push the envelope a little bit more so that we can continue, because it's not going to work for us to continue to stand in solidarity when it's kind of partial solidarity. We have to decolonize our language. We have to decolonize our minds in Palestine and outside of Palestine. I really want you all to, just start to be a lot more critical of the solidarity that you see here and all over the world, what stipulations it comes with. Because you ask Palestinians on the ground, and they're always very wary of foreigners, I'm sorry to say, foreigners and foreign aid that comes, because they don't know what it comes with. In my own village, U.S. aid, right, did a lot of road work in the village, but a lot of people complained that it wasn't good, that it actually made the roads worse. So that's just one example, but there's a lot of examples where it's not just infrastructure, it's the fact that a lot of this foreign aid comes with, stipulations where we can't resist the way we're supposed to resist. The only way, I think, is for us to continue to support resistance in all forms, respect Palestinians' way of resistance, whatever it may be. To the first question about Palestinian foreign aid and why it's important, and talking about, for example, sympathetic governments that would like to give aid, I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing, but we cannot continue to depend on it any longer. I mean, we've seen a lot of aid not come through to Gaza, for example, where many people pledged, or many governments had pledged aid to go to Gaza. And it really shouldn't be this cycle where Gaza gets destroyed every 2 years, every 3 years, waits for aid to not come even, and then try to build and get destroyed again. I think this dependency and this cycle of foreign aid coming, the foreign aid shouldn't come in money, in material support. It should come in sanctions against Israel, for example, right? Because Israel continues to break international law. And if we even say within the international arena that the international laws are just, and of course it's not always the case, but even on an international level, if we accept this as a standard and it continues to not adhere to this standard, then we have to do more. Right? We have to put a stop to the destruction, whether it's in Gaza in the form of bombs and just physical destruction, whether it's in the West Bank, where it's continuous armed occupation and impediment on movement. I mean, wherever in Palestine, really. That's my point. My point is that how long can we depend? I mean, we've been occupied since 1948. It's going to be 70 years next year. 70 years. Where has foreign aid gotten us besides losing more land, right? Besides, losing grips of our homeland, really. Besides more people not having access to Palestine, whether it's Palestinians themselves who are in the diaspora or allies. We've only gotten worse. So my point is that it's a temporary solution, but it's not going to help us in the long run. And that's why we have to think outside of foreign aid. I know it sounds bizarre for me to come and say, no foreign aid, but I'm also saying that in addition to no foreign aid, in parallel to no foreign aid, there should be action against the oppressor at the same time for it to stop. I'm not saying just cut off foreign aid and let Israel do whatever it wants. We also have to act in a proactive way. And it's not to just continue to put bandages that don't fix anything. That is really my point. To the next, I don't know if the question after that was, I think when it was mentioned about the Samadoun protest, which I definitely support, and I think that that's a weekly solidarity action that anyone can go to and should definitely go to if they're around. One of the things that I continue to see is that, and I said this on May Day, I spoke on behalf of Al-Auda, Palestine Right to Return Coalition, that some people who came and they were just looking around and they might have been supportive of the actions and what was happening in May Day had a problem with Palestinian presence there, Palestinian flag. They actually started to say some racist comments and they were pretending to be like some entertainers on YouTube or something like this. And it's just something that we continue to see where a lot of issues are being covered and a lot of issues are being addressed, but when Palestine comes, it's too radical of an issue. Meanwhile, Palestine actually encompasses a lot of these issues. I mean, if you talk about environmental justice, if you talk about LGBTQ oppression, for example, right? There's a lot of pinkwashing that goes on in a way where it makes it look like Palestinians are the ones that are not tolerant. What's the occupation that's not tolerant of Palestinians who identify as LGBTQ? What about them, you know? What about them? There's anything really that you want to say about any kind of oppression, workers' oppression, immigrant oppression, whatever the case may be, you're going to find it. Obviously, indigenous oppression exists, oppression against indigenous people, but there's so many facets of that. And so we have to keep thinking about how Palestine's always being sidelined, and why it's important for us to be very vocal about our solidarity with Palestine. And yes, to answer the question about why they've been removing salt from the water, it is because it is a lot harder to continue a hunger strike just drinking water. Salt gives you more energy, right? And that's why they do it. But it's not just the salt that they've removed. A lot of people have been put in solitary confinement. A lot of communication between Palestinian prisoners and their families have been restricted even further. They're just trying to, have them stop the hunger strike and just destroy their resolve so that they don't continue with it. In terms of the history of the Nakba, that's a very long, that needs like its own workshop, and maybe we can do something like a Nakba one-on-one here or wherever you all want to do. Nakba translates to catastrophe, and it happened in 1948 on May 15th, starting May 14th, May 15th. And I was saying that it was in the works for many years, since the 1800s actually, right? Where this Zionist project was going to happen, and it just after the Balfour Declaration is when people were driven out in an official and a forceful manner in 1948 in May, and that's what we're commemorating on Saturday. I feel like if I start, I won't be able to stop, to be honest. But it's something that people are very mindful of, because me, for example, I'm from the West Bank, and I'm not allowed to go to a lot of places in Palestine as a Palestinian in the West Bank because I hold West Bank documents, right? Whereas many of you actually would be able to go to most places except maybe Gaza, but some of you have even been to Gaza. I haven't been to Gaza, and the furthest out of the West Bank I've been was Jerusalem, but that's not because I was allowed to go, that's because I found a way to go. That's something that I think the Nakba, if you think about it, if you ask any Palestinian, they tell you that there's something that they're missing that they haven't experienced. In the West Bank, for example, a lot of people haven't seen a body of water, right? They'd have to leave Palestine, for example, in order to see a body of water. Palestinians don't experience landing in Palestine on a plane unless they are granted access to travel through Tel Aviv airport, or they have Israeli citizenship. But myself and my family members, we'd have to cross the border through Jordan. We never land. And these are small, trivial things, but I was in Lebanon this past summer, and I can tell you that many people, we actually went to the border. We traveled north to the border south, I should say north, to the northern border of Palestine. We were traveling south, and these are people that were born in refugee camps, Palestinians. We actually met with people that experienced the Nakba firsthand, that told us about how they walked from places like, they walked from the northern parts of Palestine and they ended up in Lebanon, and they told us, we wish we would have known that we wouldn't be able to go back. We would have never left. They thought that they could come back after things settled down. They did not know that they would be driven out of their homes forever, you know, and many people unfortunately are dying without being able to go back to see their homelands, and it's really terrible. The refugee crisis in Lebanon is worse than a lot of places in the Arab world in terms of Palestinians, because they suffer from a lot of racism and discrimination, unfortunately, and that's another story. You can ask me about it more if you would like. The recent appointment of the new Hamas leader, yes, it is Ismail Haniyeh. I honestly don't know that much because I know it happened very recently, but I imagine that it happened because he's a pretty dominant figure in the party, and it must have happened through some form of elections in Hamas. I couldn't personally tell you what I think about it even, you know, it's just business as usual in these factions, and I couldn't tell you intricate details, but we can explore it a little bit more. I hope that's a sufficient answer. I'm sorry that I'm not prepared to answer fully at this time. The community outreach, I mean, the most amazing thing is that we have such a large population of Palestinians here in Brooklyn and even in the Bronx, for example. I'm sure scattered throughout New York, like Queens and Staten Island for sure, and here maybe. But in Bay Ridge, it's very iconic because you see a lot of Arab businesses and they've established themselves, and this is what we do in the diaspora. So we've been doing this not just this year for this march and rally, but we've done it for other things where we give out leaflets and let people know of things that they can boycott. You know, the thing is about working with the Palestinian community and the Arab community, you can't fault them for this, is because they're afraid of many things, afraid of being active. We've seen a lot of youth, for example, get very excited and they join the efforts of Palestinian groups and solidarity groups, and then they disappear because their parents don't want them to do it anymore. It's not because they don't believe in it, it's because they're afraid for their safety. They're afraid that they're going to be entrapped by cops, and this is a reality of many youth here in this community. I mean, I went to Brooklyn College, and I don't know if you know, but there were entrapments and just undercover cops that were pretending to be, you know, normal students, Muslim, approaching students, getting very familiar with the students in such an intimate way, in a way where, like, this woman who was a cop was invited to people's weddings. You know, she formed such a relationship with them that she was invited to their very private events. She couldn't find anything on any of the students, and you know, she had to move on, and she ended up entrapping two women that were very vulnerable in the Muslim community. This is a reality. I mean, I finished Brooklyn College, but it was such a struggle for us to organize, even on the campus level. You know, I'm not talking about anything too radical. I'm talking about going through the whole process of, you know, getting approval from campus for very little things. I mean, they didn't even want us to have Omar Barouti, and all he does is, I'm not belittling what he does, but he just advocates for boycott. You know, that's all. He doesn't advocate for anything more radical than that, and many others. It was such a racist thing because any little mention of Palestine, and I even heard people say Palestine is a political statement, you know? And yeah, I guess it is. I mean, but they make it sound like it's a curse word or something, like that we can't talk about it, we have to push it aside. We're talking about a public institution where there should be freedom of speech, and they invite people like Pamela Geller to, you know, come on campus and spew hatred, whereas we can't organize, and we were impeded in so many ways. I could go on and tell you. But besides the impediments, to be honest, the fact was that a lot of students were afraid, and this was even before they found out that there were cops on campus spying on them. They were afraid because they knew, and it turned out that it was true. you know? They didn't want to organize. And if it's not being afraid because cops are watching, it's being afraid because they can't find a job if their name is anywhere on solidarity with Palestine, for example, right? And you've got websites like Canary Mission profiling not only Palestinians, but many people like you know, who are not Palestinian, who end up being on Canary Mission and who are going to be labeled as quote-unquote anti-Semites, right? Which is another term that we have to think about how it's not accurate to begin with. So these are many things that we deal with, and outreach in the community has been good, but there's a lot of work to do because we have to. Besides that, also, I mean, undocumented people, for example, they don't want to get involved, and who can blame them, really, especially in times like these. So you know, we try to reach out. I try to be in the community and talk and be like a familiar face, and it really helps when you speak the language and you are of the community. There's a lot of work to do, but we definitely appreciate all the support that we get from all of you. Thank you.